Rome is the kind of thing that feels eternal. Stone, roads, legions, law, the habit of winning. And that's why the story of how it started to crumble sounds especially chilling. Because what collapses first isn't a wall or a border. What collapses first is the brain of the system. After Marcus Aurelius, a man who was still trying to hold the empire together with morality, discipline, and meaning, his son Commodus takes the throne, and it's like Rome gets switched into party forever mode. The first months even look decent. He does what always works on the crowd: money, gifts, spectacles. Rome loves being fed and entertained, and Commodus figured that out fast. He buys popularity, not with policy or reforms, but with festivals. The problem is, you can't run an empire like a banquet. The banquet ends, and the bills remain. And that's where the first real crack appears. Commodus quickly loses interest in actually governing. Power slips to courtiers, favorites, a circle that lives next to the throne and slowly starts believing the state is their personal feeding trough. Meanwhile, the emperor is more and more focused not on borders, laws, or the army, but on pleasure and self-display. And Rome, which had lived through a golden age under the 5 good emperors, starts recognizing old nightmares again. The days when the emperor wasn't the peak of the state, but its main problem. The system might have survived if Commodus had been merely lazy, but he becomes dangerous. In the year historians mark as 183, an episode happens that poisons the rest of his reign, an assassination attempt. In the dark, an attacker approaches him and delivers a line that sounds like a sentence. "The Senate sends this to you." The attacker is caught, tortured into a confession, and the name of Lucilla, Commodus's sister, surfaces. From that point on, something flips inside Commodus. Paranoia. And that is deadly for an empire. Because an emperor's paranoia in Rome means one thing: informers return. The atmosphere comes back where you can be taken down not for a crime, but for suspicion. Where the friends of an executed man become dangerous simply because they were his friends. Where confiscation turns into a business model for those closest to the throne. The state stops being a machine that protects rules and becomes a machine that protects fear. But there's one more thing that finishes off what's left of imperial authority: the arena. Commodus does something that, for Rome, sounds like an insult to the very idea of government. He turns the imperial office into a show. He steps into the arena, trains, poses, plays the role of a champion. And yes, the crowd can roar with excitement, but the senators and the elite see something else. A state that once ruled the world, now being ruled by a man who cares more about applause than about the frontier. It's a subtle but devastating shift. Rome stops fearing the throne. And when people stop fearing the throne, they start tasting it. By the end of the year we call 192, patience runs out. They try to poison him, it doesn't work. Then they kill him for real. The plot isn't carried out by barbarians or enemies from outside, it's carried out by people inside the palace. Members of his closest circle who understand that the emperor has become too toxic even for his own guards. And the one who physically does it is Narcissus, a strongman and wrestler close enough to finish the job quickly. It's a deeply Roman symbol. The emperor is not cut down by a sword on the battlefield, but strangled by the hands of someone from his inner circle, in his own space. Afterward, the Senate declares Commodus an enemy of the state, and tries to erase his memory. Statues come down, names are scraped away, inscriptions destroyed, like cutting out a tumor. But the core problem can't be erased, because Commodus's real legacy isn't his scandals or his vices. His real legacy is the habit inside the army and the palace of settling the question of power by force. And that habit becomes an addiction. It will return again and again. The next act is even more cynical, because after Commodus's death, Rome shows the world that imperial power is something you can Sell. The year remembered as the year of the 5 emperors turns the throne into a market commodity, and that's not a metaphor. In a short span, rulers change like cards in a bad game. One emperor lasts briefly, he's killed. Then another appears who essentially buys the support of the Praetorians. And that's the psychological breakpoint. The moment a soldier realizes he doesn't have to serve the state, he can trade the state. From there, the rest becomes inevitable. The provinces, the legions, the generals look at Rome and think, if power at the top is taken through intrigue and gold, why should we obey? And the struggle begins among men who command real armies. Septimius Severus wins, and with him begins an era where the army becomes the main source of legitimacy. Not the Senate, not tradition, not we are citizens of Rome, but soldiers and their commander. The Severans often look like stabilizers after the nightmare of Commodus, and partly they are. They can impose order with brute force. But inside that, stability is poison. Severus strengthens the army, pays it, relies on it, makes it the main pillar of the regime. The Senate becomes set-dressing, and politics becomes management through military loyalty. And that changes everything from the economy to the psychology of society. The empire starts living not for law, but for the barracks. And when an empire lives for the barracks, every new commander starts to look more important than every new law. At the same time, something happens that slowly turns the empire into a system of permanent strain. Costs rise, and they have to be covered. Taxes crush the provinces. Money loses value, and the army demands more and more. Rome falls into a trap where there's only one way to hold power, pay the soldiers, and only one way to pay them, squeeze the population until people start fleeing, hiding, resisting, or simply stop believing any of it makes sense. Then comes Caracalla, a man remembered not as a reformer, but as a brutal ruler. Yet he makes a move that looks wise on the surface and ruthlessly practical underneath. In the year commonly given as 212, he grants Roman citizenship to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire. On the outside, it sounds like sweeping equality. Everyone is Roman now. But on the inside, it sounds different. Everyone is a taxpayer now. Citizenship expands the tax base. If earlier part of the population didn't pay certain citizen taxes, now nearly everyone does. This isn't a gift, it's a financial operation on a continental scale. And here's the key point. Rome always rested on a contract. We protect, you pay, you believe in the system. When taxes rise and security falls, the contract breaks. Caracalla's repression, fear, war, and public cruelty all drain trust. And once trust collapses, Rome does what Rome always does, a plot. Caracalla is killed. The empire sinks deeper into the cycle. A ruler arrives, crushes, loses support, and is removed by force. And each turn of that cycle leaves more than blood behind it, leaves a habit of living without a future. People stop planning. For elites, intrigue becomes more profitable than building. For soldiers, overthrow becomes more profitable than discipline. For provinces, autonomy becomes more attractive than the center. And that's already a disease, not just bad individuals. Then comes Elagabalus, a 14-year-old emperor who becomes, in popular memory, a symbol of moral and governmental decay. His biographies are often written by enemies and clearly aim to shock, so they can be exaggerated. But even if you subtract the propaganda, the main point remains. The throne starts to look unserious. Rome, the city that built roads and aqueducts, now lives on rumors of a court where religion becomes a costume and power becomes theater. Elagabalus plays with cults, breaks with old customs, enrages the elite, and is eventually killed. And again the pattern repeats. They don't cure the body, they just cut out another symptom. Alexander Severus then tries to restore normality. He draws closer to the Senate, brings senators into the council, supports the impoverished elite, tries to keep the machine functioning. But against him, the bigger truth stands out. The system is exhausted. The empire has become too heavy, too expensive, too unsafe, and most of all, too accustomed to the idea that power changes by violence. Eventually, Alexander Severus is killed too, and his death opens the door to the period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. The crisis of the 3rd century sounds like the end of the world in bureaucratic form. Decades in which emperors change so rapidly that the very concept of succession disappears. Military units raise up their own commanders, usurpers multiply like weeds. And you can imagine what that means in practice. Any large army, any strong general, any successful campaign becomes a political bid, because the emperor no longer holds a mandate of Rome. He holds an army behind him. And if the army is the source of power, then power becomes mobile. It moves wherever the legions stand. The main problem isn't that there are many emperors. The main problem is that every new ruler begins with war, either against external enemies or against internal rivals. War destroys fields, roads, warehouses, logistics. Trade collapses, epidemics spread, people flee, and a closed loop forms. Less economy, less tax revenue, worse army and supply, more invasions and revolts, less economy again. What once made Rome strong, its network of cities, commerce, law, transport, starts to sag like a house on a sinking foundation. In this chaos, the empire truly fractures. In the West, a separate state emerges, remembered as the Gallic Empire. In the East, Palmyra rises, and at a certain point, Zenobia turns the region into a de facto independent power. And the center can't just press a button and restore everything, because the center no longer has stable authority. It's busy, surviving. The symbolic shock of the era is the story of Emperor Valerian. In the year marked as 260, he is captured by the Persian king Shapur I. For Rome, it's a psychological catastrophe, a reigning emperor in captivity. The outside world sees Rome as not invincible. The provinces see the center as not all-powerful. Rivals and barbarians see that the great empire can lose not only battles, but face. And when a state loses face, it begins losing territory. But Rome is not only decline, it also has a strange ability to survive. Even in this hell, a chance appears. That chance is Aurelian. He acts like someone who understands one simple truth. First reassemble the empire physically, then talk about beautiful ideals. He retakes the East, crushes Palmyra, suppresses separatism, shows that the center can still be the center. Then he moves west and breaks the Gallic Empire, restoring the territories. He's remembered as the restorer of the world, not because he was kind, but because he was effective. He literally glues the cracks back together. For a brief moment, it feels like the body is still alive. But Aurelian is surgery, fast, brutal, painful. What comes next must be therapy. And that's where Diocletian enters. A man who does what earlier Romans would have called a curse. He turns the system of first among equals into absolute monarch. He establishes the dominate. The emperor no longer pretends to be merely the princeps. He becomes the master. Rome finally admits what it once feared for centuries. Absolute power is the only way to hold such a massive territory together in an age of constant wars and internal coups. Diocletian sees the core problem. The empire is too big to be ruled by one man, and too unstable to keep playing old constitutional games. So, he creates the Tetrarchy divides rule among 4 emperors, each closer to key frontiers and able to respond quickly. It's an attempt to turn the empire from one center and endless provinces into a network of controlled centers. It's rational, it's harsh, and it works for a while. Less chaos, more control, more manageability. But Diocletian faces another front, the religious one. The number of Christians grows, and this isn't just a faith group. It's the social network of late antiquity. Communities, mutual aid, morality, a new meaning. People exhausted by endless war and elite corruption are drawn to inner discipline, salvation, responsibility, a different kind of truth. For a state that demanded ritual loyalty to the old gods and to the emperor himself, this looks like a threat. So Diocletian launches what becomes the last great pagan strike against Christianity, the Great Persecution, usually linked to the year 303. Harsh repression begins, destruction of books, pressure on communities, punishments, attempts to break the religion through fear. But the paradox is that terror often makes a religion stronger. It creates martyrs, binds people together, turns faith into identity. And Christianity emerges from that period more organized, more resilient, more widespread. Then comes one of the rarest turns in political history. Diocletian voluntarily steps down. In the year commonly given as 305, he abdicates and retreats to his palace. It was so unusual that contemporaries almost saw it as unreal. A ruler who could have clung to the throne chooses to walk away. And that's where the famous image appears. When they ask him to return, he supposedly answers with something like, "Look at my cabbages. A man who once ruled the world chooses a garden over power." It's funny because it's absurd and chilling because it suggests even he knew the system devours you. After Diocletian, tensions rise again. But he has done the crucial thing. He has rebuilt the state for an age of survival. Yet the problem is no longer only how to rule. The problem is why people should believe. And that's where Constantine appears. He understands the empire can't stand on swords and taxes alone anymore. It needs a meaning strong enough to bind people tighter than fear. And if Christianity can't be destroyed, it must be legalized, integrated, turned into part of a new order. The year 313 is associated with the Edict of Milan, a turn toward religious tolerance and an end to official persecution. And this isn't pure idealism. It's state logic. The empire benefits from stopping a war against its own communities and starting to use them as support, as moral glue, a source of discipline and meaning. Constantine then makes another step that changes the map of history. He shifts the center of gravity eastward, strengthens a new political core, and turns Constantinople into a capital of a new scale. Strategically, it makes sense. The East is richer, more urban, closer to vital routes and dangerous frontiers. But for the West, it means becoming less prioritized exactly when it needs maximum resources. And then comes the last, most merciless wave. Not internal intrigues, not one bad emperor, but a movement of peoples that no decree can stop. The Huns push the Goths push against the empire's borders, and a chain migration begins. Think of it like a massive piston. One force presses another, that presses the next, and all of it ends up driving into Rome's frontier. And Rome, which had learned how to handle raids and wars, now has to handle populations moving in masses, families, tribes, alliances, entire peoples. One of the turning points is the disaster at Adrianople on the 9th of August in the year 378, when the Eastern Emperor Valens suffers a crushing defeat against the Goths. It shows that the Roman army no longer guarantees victory, and the barbarians are no longer just raiders, they're forces capable of breaking a regular imperial army. That changes everything. Now, the barbarians aren't just outside the system, they're inside it. They become foederati, allies, mercenaries, border guards. They receive land in exchange for service. They become part of the military machine. It seems practical. If you lack soldiers, hire people who can fight. But it carries a price. The price is that a foederatus is an ally who guards the border today and asks tomorrow, why should we obey Rome at all? And when the center lacks money, discipline, and charisma, the answer becomes obvious. Barbarian commanders gain influence over politics. Barbarian troops set conditions. The empire slowly turns from Roman into post-Roman, even if the signboard still hangs. The West becomes a land of compromises and temporary fixes. Today you ally with one tribe against another. Tomorrow that tribe demands more land. The day after, they place their man in a key position. And then you wake up and realize your army is no longer truly yours. Your economy is no longer yours. Your authority is a piece of paper held by whoever has the sword. And then comes the symbolic point. The year 476. Odoacer, backed by Germanic troops and part of the forces in Italy, forces the young Romulus Augustulus to abdicate and takes control. The imperial regalia are sent to the Eastern Emperor as if history is saying, the West can no longer carry a separate crown. Formally, this looks like the end. But in reality, the end happened earlier because by this moment the throne had long ceased to be the center, and Rome had long ceased to be the only point where the world held together. And here is the most uncomfortable thought. The most important thought isn't the date. The date is a convenient label. The real death of the Western Empire is a long process that begins far earlier, when power becomes something you can buy. When the army becomes a political marketplace, when taxes start crushing the provinces, when the coin stops being honest, when morality turns into theater and theater turns into governance. Rome didn't fall because the barbarians were stronger. The barbarians became stronger at the moment Rome stopped being the Rome that inspired fear, the moment it stopped commanding respect for rules, the moment it began losing to itself on the inside. And there is something almost universally terrifying in that. Any empire can hold on through walls and swords, but it usually collapses when people inside stop believing it means anything. And if you look at this story honestly, the fall of Rome isn't one disaster, it's a chain. Commodus turns the throne into a show and makes paranoia normal. The year of the 5 emperors turns power into a commodity. The Severans turn the state into a servant of the army. Caracalla expands citizenship, but turns it into a tax mechanism that increases pressure. The crisis of the 3rd century destroys succession and the economy. Diocletian saves the machine, but makes it harsher and more frightening, essentially admitting the old Rome is dead. Constantine rewires meaning, shifts the center, makes the East stronger and the West weaker, and the migration wave finishes what remains of the Western structure. But, and this is the last twist that makes it all feel cold, Rome doesn't vanish, it changes form. The eastern half survives. Roman law outlives the empire. Language, architecture, administrative habits, legal culture, all of it becomes the foundation of Europe. Rome falls as a state, but wins as an idea. And that may be the strangest victory in history. The empire dies, yet its tools keep shaping the world through its heirs. And that's why this story hits so hard. Because it shows that eternity is an illusion. Stone cracks, roads vanish under weeds, legions change masters, law becomes decoration. The habit of winning becomes the habit of surviving. And once a state crosses that line, you can't save it with one reform. You can only change its shape and hope the new shape lasts longer. And what's most unsettling is that it doesn't start with the Huns or a siege. It starts when power stops being responsibility and becomes a stage. When the state stops being a system of rules and becomes a system of fear. When people stop respecting the throne and start tasting it like prey. And after that, the question is no longer whether an empire will fall. The only question is how long it can keep pretending it's still alive.